Marhaba, welcome to AMAN Podcasts, from Bahrain's top experts fighting financial crime. At AMAN, we harness cutting-edge AI to keep Bahraini businesses and authorities safe from financial crime. Join us as we dive into the driving forces behind financial crime and spotlight Bahrain's strategic efforts to strengthen anti-financial crime defenses, uniting government and industry in a shared mission. Each episode highlights the people, technologies, and innovations driving the future of financial crime prevention and showcasing Bahrain's leadership in the field. Find out more at aman-aml.com.
Hello, and welcome to the AMAN Podcast, where we explore all things financial crime and compliance in Bahrain. My name's Sophia, and I'm a Senior Investigations Analyst for AMAN. In today's episode, we're taking a closer look at our latest research on financial crime risks in Bahrain and how regional transnational crime is shaping that landscape. We'll cover key findings from a report we published last year, as well as follow-on research to explore how drug trafficking threats are evolving and why this all matters for financial crime risk and regulatory readiness. This work is central to AMAN's broader focus on preparing the kingdom for its upcoming FATF mutual evaluation later this year. As that evaluation approaches, understanding emerging and converging risks is more important than ever, particularly where illicit finance, international cooperation, and regulatory compliance intersect. The Financial Action Task Force expects countries to have a clear understanding of their risk landscape. In Bahrain, drug trafficking has emerged as a major risk within the wider financial crime environment. But tackling it isn't just about intercepting shipments at ports or borders. It's also about making sure industries across the board, from banks and logistic companies to tech firms, understand the risks and are equipped to respond. In this episode, we'll dig into how the global drug trade is evolving, what regional trends mean for Bahrain, and how AMAN's research can help businesses and policymakers stay ahead, especially as the kingdom works to meet FATF expectations. Our guest today is Eliza Thompson, a researcher on our Insight team. Eliza and I have been leading our work on drug trafficking, so today's conversation should be a really interesting one. We'll be diving into some of the more detailed and surprising findings from our research. Welcome, Eliza.
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Okay, great. Let's dive right in. So, the global illicit drug trade is a highly lucrative, multi-$100 billion industry that continues to evolve, with 2025 reports highlighting record high cocaine production and a booming synthetic drug market. Like other regions, the Gulf has seen an increase in its trade routes being used for trafficking, and the region is also emerging as a growing consumer market. How is Bahrain specifically affected by these trends?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first off, the drug trafficking landscape across the Gulf as a whole is really evolving in several really interesting ways. So due to the region's strategic physical location, really as a central trade hub connecting so many different transit zones and ports, there's really been a history of it being used as a drug transit zone that connects both production hubs to high demand markets such as Europe. But it's also been emerging more recently as a growing consumer market. So especially for synthetic drugs such as Captagon. And then we're also seeing a shift in drug production hubs across the region. So areas traditionally associated with the production of one drug now are associated with the production of another. So we're seeing this in Afghanistan, for instance, as the Taliban kind of crack down on heroin production. Now we're seeing a lot of new meth production and meth trafficking, which is really interesting. So I think there's kind of these things all go together in terms of criminal networks having a broader market reach and diversifying their tactics. And then we're also seeing a notable shift in regional power players. So more sophisticated networks are taking the lead in trafficking operations as well. So all these trends are really coming together to create a really worrying picture where law enforcement is really having to try and figure out these new dynamics and where certain risks are coming from, who kind of key players are. So there's a lot going on in terms of changes. And then another really interesting trend is the connection between Gulf-based networks and organized criminal groups in the region, particularly in Europe. So these are often referred to today as super cartels. You might see that in the news articles kind of talking about these groups that are really spanning the whole globe and kind of combining different organized crime networks that you might not have seen working together maybe 15 years ago. So it's a really interesting development where a lot of these kind of regional actors are now coming together and kind of creating these super cartels where they work hand in hand. And these groups often are using really highly sophisticated commercial and financial tactics to move really large volumes of drugs and also other illicit goods as well. And a really key thing they're doing is using legitimate shipping and trade infrastructure. So they're using kind of commercial shipping vehicles and other methods today. And so it's not really as much of these kind of underground illicit smuggling networks, but more of these kind of highly sophisticated trafficking organizations. So in terms of Bahrain specifically, I think a lot of these issues are really at play in Bahrain, and given its position at the crossroad of a lot of key maritime routes in the Gulf, the country really sits at the heart of a lot of these players and actors as they kind of figure out new routes and new approaches and new networks. So these criminal groups are looking to expand their tactics and move products through these production hubs and trade routes. So a lot of them might be looking to target Bahrain and kind of add it into the mix in terms of ports that they're going through. And then the country has seen some really interesting shifts in terms of drugs coming into the country as well, and it becoming more of a consumer market, again, for some of these synthetic drugs especially. Yeah, I think that's just kind of high level, some of the trends we're seeing.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned the trend of criminals increasingly using commercial vessels and other large-scale operations to move illicit drugs across the Gulf. Could you expand on this? I think it's a really important development and worth digging into in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really important trend and something that's happening globally and especially in the Gulf. So, criminal networks are increasingly moving away from smaller, more traditional smuggling methods and increasingly using commercial vehicles and vessels and then other large scale operations around transportation. So, commercial ships not only allow them to move more drugs in higher volume at once, but another really key thing is that they actually kind of add a level of protection as well. So, a lot of these ships operate under a national flag. And so, because of that, they're protected under international law. So, foreign authorities can't easily board a commercial vessel without the flag state's consent. So, this makes law enforcement measures much harder. So this is under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So we're seeing that where there's been kind of issues with law enforcement measures in the Gulf region in terms of being able to actually board and look through and seize drugs on these larger ships versus if you have more traditional fishing boats, for instance, that have been used to traffic goods in the region, these don't fall under the same protections. So I think that's really interesting. Another key thing is that a lot of these trafficking networks are actually directly investing in commercial vehicles or vessels, and they're really kind of turning them effectively into a business asset. So this gives them more control over their operations. It really legitimizes them so they can be seen as, this kind of shipping network in a sense. So there's less suspicion there. And also, it's another asset that they're investing kind of this illicit funds into. So that's another kind of vehicle for laundering often. And this is also part of a broader shift we're seeing where Gulf-based networks are connecting with international criminal groups, as I mentioned, kind of these super cartels. And this is especially a trend in Europe. So a lot of kind of criminal groups working around the Mediterranean, for instance, and they're really adopting sophisticated commercial and financial tactics. So a lot of them use shell companies, really complex shipping routes, and kind of these wide networks. So for instance, you might see a shell company that's registered in Asia. It owns a ship leaving a European port, and then that ship, for instance, is headed to Saudi Arabia. But beneath all that paperwork and legitimate shipping, you might see that there's actually drugs on that ship originally sourced from Syria, for instance, especially kind of a lot of these Middle East hubs ship through Europe and then back to the Gulf, which seems counterintuitive. But they do that because using European ports kinds of it lends this shield of legitimacy to shipments because you can say, well, it's coming from Europe. So it kind of gives this stamp of approval in a sense. So I think that's a really key trend we've seen recently.
Absolutely, and that's a really interesting finding. Another key finding from our research was around the Middle East's illicit captagon market. Captagon, a synthetic stimulant widely popular in the region, has seen something of a reboot over the past few years. Could you tell us a bit more about this and explain what risks it poses for Bahrain, both as a transit hub and as a potential consumer market?
Yeah, I think this is another key area to be on the watch for across the Gulf. So, as you said, it's become a really popular drug in the region, a lot of consumer markets, especially in Gulf countries. So, the Captagon trade is a highly addictive synthetic drug, and it was largely associated with the Assad regime. So, during the Assad regime's kind of financial struggles and isolation, it was viewed as a really key financing mechanism for the regime. So it really had a lot of control over both the production and illicit networks. But then with the collapse of the regime in 2024, there's really been this shift and this turning point. And in part, that's because the new Syrian regime has signaled that it is cracking down on the production of the drug and trafficking in the country. So there's been kind of mixed results, I would say, in terms of how successful it's being, but they have done a lot of raids and a lot of cracking down on production sites within the country. So I do think that there's definitely kind of a lot of these illicit networks are worried about continuing making Syria kind of the hub in a sense. So there's been new production sites that are popping up elsewhere in the region. So I think that, this obviously creates a lot of risks, both for the Middle East as a whole, but also for Gulf countries specifically. Perhaps kind of the most concerning development is reportedly the growing role of Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen being used as production sites, and then Houthi networks being used to facilitate trafficking. So late last year, for instance, Yemenese authorities seized 1.5 million Captagon pills worth an estimated 30 million in street value. So these were hidden in trucks traveling from Houthi-controlled areas into Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is right now kind of the key consumer market. It has the most demand for the drug. And Yemenese officials highlighted that the bust really reflects a growing presence of extensive production within Houthi-controlled territory. And then Yemenese authorities also reported that they believe Iran is involved. So the government is helping to finance the production of these production hubs, and also supporting in terms of helping to facilitate the trafficking itself. So these are really, I think, worrying developments on multiple levels for Bahrain specifically. I think, as a transit hub in the region, anytime you have new actors and new routes, that means authorities really have to kind of start shifting in terms of looking at evolving smuggling methods and different kind of threat landscape in that sense. I think in terms of kind of this Houthi development itself, one of the biggest risks is that pills might be able to actually enter Bahrain via Yemen and then Saudi Arabia, since Bahrain and Saudi Arabia share a causeway. So you can have just, private and transport vehicles coming through Saudi Arabia into Bahrain that are carrying pills that were originally produced in Yemen. So that might be a pattern we start seeing more of. And that's, I think, really worrying because these pills are extremely small, lightweight, high value. So these things make it really easy for them to be smuggled just via cars and trucks. So you might see more decentralized, low volume trafficking, and that's much harder for authorities to detect. So seeing kind of this land route appearing that allows for really decentralized, harder to detect trafficking, I think is a really key concern.
I think that's a really important point, and it's something that we see again and again across our research, this key element of how geopolitical and domestic shifts across the Middle East affect key production and transit hubs, creating new trafficking patterns and risks. We're seeing a similar trend with methamphetamine, which has surged in the region. Could you tell us a little bit more about these patterns?
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the consistent patterns we're seeing in our research is just how quickly traffickers adapt. I think that's true across the board for any region or any drug type. So, whether it's a government crackdown on drug production within their borders or a new regional conflict or geopolitical issue that impacts shipping routes, criminals are really quick to move production sites, reroute shipments, expand to new drug markets entirely. So I think meth production really illustrates this perfectly. So its production has really surged in the region, particularly in the Golden Crescent region, which historically has been associated with being a major hub for heroin production. So this region really consists of Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And it's been seen, as I said, more associated with heroin, but in the last few years has been a major increase in meth production and trafficking. And this is due largely to crackdown in heroin production, especially by the Taliban. So there's, to be seen how much of this kind of trend continues. I think there's some evidence that heroin is back on the rise in the region, and maybe it'll be more balanced in terms of the production of both. But anyway, I think, just the fact that there's much more of this meth production in general is definitely a new development in recent years. And so for Bahrain, this is really worrying, as Iran has actually been one of the main source countries for illicit drugs entering the kingdom over the last decade. So the increase in meth production in the region, in the Golden Crescent countries, could mean potentially an increase in meth trafficking into Bahrain. And that I think is really concerning, just because especially meth has a really outsized public health impact, especially among youth and kind of more vulnerable populations. And then also it can produce a bigger strain on law enforcement and regulatory systems as well. So not a drug I would say that you want to see trending into your country. And then also from a security perspective, meth trafficking networks are really sophisticated and are often linked to broader criminal and illicit financial systems. So oftentimes, these groups use logistics routes, shell companies, financial channels to move drugs, launder the proceeds, and pay off corrupt officials. And then over time, these same pathways can then be repurposed to move weapons, to evade sanctions, to funnel funds into regional conflicts, even in some cases, to arm extremist groups. So I think this really amplifies wider security risks in the region where you have these networks kind of solidifying. That's definitely another key risk. So I think for, what this means for Bahrain specifically, this shows that you really need a multi-layered approach. So it's not just about intercepting shipments at ports or borders, but also really monitoring financial flows and really tracing the money, as we say. So I think also for Bahrain specifically, what this means is that it really needs to take a multi-layered approach. So it's not just about intercepting shipments at ports or borders, but also really monitoring financial flows and kind of following the money, as we say. So it's really about disrupting these networks before they gain a foothold. So for companies in Bahrain, especially financial institutions and professional services, it's really important to look at kind of how they're being impacted potentially by these networks and how they can help follow the money and make sure that they don't have a client, for instance, that works in shipping and potentially has links to these networks. So I think that's kind of a new development in terms of the illicit finance and kind of more of the transnational security threat as well.
Those are all really interesting and also really concerning findings in terms of evolving trafficking routes, new players, and new production routes in the region. So I want to turn now to what this all means for the public and private sector alike in the kingdom and how it fits into the broader financial crime landscape. So first off, what can we anticipate in 2026 in terms of Bahrain's drug trafficking risk and the landscape there? Which industries or sectors are likely to face the greatest exposure as traffickers continue to adapt to these regional and global trends?
Yeah, excellent question again. I think, that's something we want to be always doing, especially at Themis. A lot of our research is forward facing. So we want to be thinking not only what are these threats, what do they mean for today, but really, what is it going to mean in 6 months or a year? So looking ahead to 2026, one of the key trends we expect to see is a lot of these new drug production hubs and trafficking routes in the region really taking shape and strengthening. So as they're kind of gaining their foothold, then they're going to start really being able to move products much faster potentially. So this will directly increase Bahrain's exposure, especially in relation to countries such as Iran. And then another key trend that we expect to continue, and that's really important to be watching as a business and regulator in the kingdom, is the increasing use of commercial networks and sophisticated financial and logistic tactics to move drugs. So often, networks even thousands of miles away can kind of find their reach within the country through things like corporate vehicles, intermediaries, financial kind of transactions. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think whether you're in shipping or fintech or own a small business, you need to make sure that your company is not exposed, because it's oftentimes 2 to 3 degree separation, and a lot of these risks kind of lurk beneath the surface in a sense. But I do think there are certain sectors that are particularly vulnerable. So company service providers and other professional services, for example, they might be exploited as intermediaries for shell companies, corporate structures, cross-border transactions. So I think that's one really key sector that should be, implementing enhanced due diligence. Another one is financial services. So this would include banks, payment providers, fintech firms. These face heightened exposure as well, because traffickers often rely on these financial institutions to actually move and fund their organizations. So it's really important, again, to look at where the money is actually flowing into and out of, because that's what's actually financing these operations. And then logistics and trade businesses as well. Obviously with drug trafficking, you're going to have to use physical logistics, shipping companies, ports, but also trucking companies, land related logistics. So I think, all of these kind of companies within these areas really need to make sure that they have really a solid understanding of the risks and really making sure they're implementing enhanced due diligence as well. So yeah, I think in short, as these, production hubs and trafficking networks really continue to shift and become more sophisticated, it's really important for all companies to really have a multi-layered approach to financial crime, where they're understanding the risks and how they could relate specifically to their own businesses. And yeah, I think, all comes back kind of to this idea of due diligence. So making sure that you are making sure your partners and your supply chain is all kind of free from any of these illicit risks in a sense.
Great. So now that we've discussed some of the key trends we're tracking, we're left with the question, how does this all tie back to wider FATF preparedness and financial crime compliance in Bahrain?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, as we kind of said at the beginning, a lot of what we do at AMAN is around making sure that, we're all prepared for the upcoming mutual evaluation. So, how does this all kind of tie back? Why are we talking about drug trafficking today when, a lot of companies might just think that preparing for an evaluation is more about just AML compliance? So I'd say that, kind of the key thing is really that it's important to make sure you have a clear understanding of risk environment. So I think the Financial Action Task Force is always really looking to make sure that both regulators and private sector understand what risks they're exposed to. So for instance, if evaluators found that drug trafficking is a major threat in the country, then, making sure the private sector understands the threat is really important, because if they identify that, specific high risk sectors don't have a good understanding and that they aren't really implementing a threat based approach, then that could be a major gap identified in the evaluation. So I think, kind of the key level high takeaway is just it's important to understand all threats related to financial crime and illicit finance. They really do look at kind of predicate crimes in addition to kind of money laundering itself. So I think that's really important. And so, yeah, I think also from a compliance and readiness standpoint, it's really important for businesses to be thinking about, do you have all the controls and policies in place that are going to help you address this threat landscape? So, really making sure that you have customer and transaction checks done often and done right, that you're flagging and reporting all suspicious activity, and also that you are using all the tools at your disposal. So, from internal controls that you're testing to having technology that you're using to conduct due diligence and screening. It's really important just to make sure that you're on top in terms of what your own obligations are, both within AML, but then also the broader illicit finance landscape as a whole. So yeah, I think just, it's really important for businesses to be asking, am I potentially exposed to some of these risks? Do I understand this exposure? And then what am I doing about that exposure?
This has been a really interesting conversation. Before we sign off, Eliza, what are the key takeaways from the research and from today's discussion?
Yeah, that's a great kind of ending question. I think it's always good to kind of reflect on these trends. I'd say that, Bahrain and the Gulf more broadly really mirror a lot of the trends we're seeing across illicit finance globally. So criminal networks are just becoming more connected than ever and honestly more adaptive than ever. So they're switching tactics at unprecedented speeds. They're really using technology, corporate structures, professional services in ways to operate almost like a company today. So I think that's a really striking thing that we've seen, not just within the drug trade, but also within other illicit sectors as well, is a lot of these organizations, these networks, the last maybe 5 years are shifting in a way where if you looked at how they're structured and operating, you would think it was a company in a sense. So that's really, I think, striking. And illicit finance is just so interconnected today. So I think from super cartels to their financial networks to security issues in regions, I think, again, companies just really need to be monitoring all of these things. And I think that tackling these risks means really thinking creatively about public policy and business governance and compliance. So you really want to look at both the public and private sector aspects of it. It's really about anticipating where criminals might shift next. And then it's really about using intelligence, technology to really kind of make sure that you have the best strength against exposure. So yeah, I guess kind of in other words, we need to be using every tool at our disposal because criminals certainly are. So yeah, I just think it's about awareness and about investing in kind of both public and private sector to really stamp out a lot of these risks going forward.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Eliza, and thank you everyone for tuning in. This was our podcast on the drug trafficking risk landscape in Bahrain. You can check out our report on our website at wearethemis.com and watch out for future episodes of our AMAN podcast, where we'll continue exploring the latest in financial crime risk and compliance across the kingdom.
شكراً لحسن استماعكم. Thanks for listening to AMAN Podcasts. Stay tuned for more insights and practical steps to strengthen your AML defenses. Together, we can protect Bahrain's financial future. مع السلامة.